like I've started really letting go of the trends and what I feel like is the quote unquote right way, and letting go a lot of what I feel like will be embraced and accepted. And then the minute that I choose to go with my gut, and I've said this many times, like to myself, it's just like the minute that I stopped trying and the minute that I just kind of went with making sure that the language and that the imagery that I am using is like really accessible, and that the imagery and the language that I'm using, that it just resonates and that it's empowering and that it's not too complicated and that it's not too like, well, what is she trying to say? And like, that is what is important. If you want to say like disability solidarity, then just say it. If you want to say Black disabled lives matter, then just say it.
Welcome to Works in Process, the podcast that asks the hows and whys behind creative work. Take a ride with me, designer and educator George Garastegui, as I learn from my guests there's no one way to being a creative, but endless possibilities fueled by passion, determination, and of course, process. That's our guest, Jen White Johnson, a designer, photographer, art activist, and art educator. She teaches as an assistant professor of visual communications at Bowie State University, and her work focuses on the intersection of content and caregiving with the emphasis on redesigning ableist visual culture. When her son was diagnosed as autistic at age 2, she began to examine the absence of Black disabled children in digital and literary media. This motivated the release of an advocacy photo zine entitled KnoxRoxs, dedicated to her autistic son. Since its release, the zine has received national and international recognition, including features on AfroPunk, Today at Apple, and is permanently archived in libraries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And her activist work has been featured in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and she was recently selected as an honoree on the 2020 Diversability D30 Disability Impact List. It's for her advocacy and her artistic impact that I have her on the podcast, and I hope you enjoy the candid nature in which we discuss her artistic voice and how visuals help advance the conversation around Black and brown disabled voices. So hey Jen, how you been? Crazy year, right?
Yes, wild year. Thank you so much for holding space for me today, George.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much for being on the Works in Process podcast. I'm so psyched to talk to you today, and I really want to get into, your work, but also your creative process. But before that, let's have some fun. I like to start each episode with a rapid fire Q&A session that sets the stage for our conversation. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I hope I'm ready.
It's simple, right? No tests. Coffee or tea?
Both. Because as much as I love a nice cup of coffee to kind of get me moving, I also love like my chamomile tea. My jasmine lavender is a little bit of both. Like that's what happens,
I'm gonna see I'm gonna see a trend with these questions. Design or photography?
Both. Nah, man, I gotta be real. Both. As much as I love like just the gems of image making and composition, there's something really beautiful about the design and typography and being able to merge them both. Like there's beauty in all things. Like I cannot choose one. I'm sorry.
Research or output?
Yeah. Wow. Both. Yeah. I mean, as much as I love the output, like the end all be all, I also respect like the research process and being able to like investigate in what craft means, especially when you're getting ready to like work on something or for a presentation. Like there's something really beautiful about being able to just investigate, but then taking all of that and then showing, like the fruits of that research. So there is a hard love for both. Yes. I think both are very valid.
And let's finalize this with words or actions.
Definitely, I guess actions.
Yes. We have a decision.
Yes. I know, right? Nah, the other ones were decisions too, man. Don't be knocking people that have like multi approaches.
No, that's very true. That's very true. And so after this, we're going to do a quick word association, right? So the first word that comes up when you hear these other words. Okay? Creativity.
Truth.
Determination.
Audacity.
Business.
Relationships.
Failure.
Honesty.
Community.
Radical.
Education.
Life.
Mistakes.
Common.
Skills.
Neither here or there.
History.
Respect.
Opportunity.
Community.
Accessibility.
Important.
Future.
Children.
And last, process.
Working. Continuing to progress, continuing to be ambitious. So I guess I could say like ambition.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. I know the first group of questions is a little bit you're on both sides of the same coin. But sometimes we got to ask you about that.
No, it's important. I like it. Yeah.
So, as I read in the beginning of your episode, in your bio, you state that you're a designer, photographer, art activist, and educator. That's a lot of things. And I want to get into it all. But I first want to understand, how'd you get into photography and design?
So photo and design really just came from me wanting to continue learning and expanding my artistic horizons. I really started off during my childhood as a performer, and I had undiagnosed ADHD. I still do. And I didn't realize at the time that I really was looking for, like, I was thriving in like eccentricities. You know, I was always bubbly and full of energy and singing and always into like musicals and always just really just trying to find any way that I possibly could to just emote my happiness. And so performing, you're always wondering, okay, but if is that going to be the end all be all? And my parents always encouraged me, well, you gotta have a backup plan. You know, growing up in like the Black and Latino community is either you got it or you got to have that backup plan. And so in the event that you don't make this audition, or if you're not like on Broadway one day, what's going to be like the backup plan for you? And so my dad dabbled in painting and my mom, she's a crafter. And so watching them always making and always using their hands to build or to teach others or to give back. You know, when I enrolled in my first photo class and my first design class, I was like, wow, like this is actually something that I'm enjoying and that I want to continue learning. And it really just started off with like a basic black and white film photography class that I took at a community college, to me, which was like my favorite creative space, honestly. So big ups to like community colleges and those professors that are there, because that was where where I took my first roll of 35 millimeter film and was in the dark room and fell in love with like the smells of the fixer and all of that. And then that was like the first space where I was able to get into digital photography. And then where I took my first design classes, and I was like, man, like this is really beautiful, being able to kind of mix both and being able to like understand how both can equally communicate and celebrate, you know, so many things. So that was how I got into it.
Okay, seeing a trend here, the both.
Yes, come on now.
No, that's really important. It's really important to think about that there are multiple avenues and multiple ways to one, be into something, but also navigate creativity from multiple point of views. In that learning process, who do you think was your biggest supporter?
I would say my family and my friends. I had a really good, you know, girl group that they were just kind of like my go-to, and they were all like bridesmaids like at my wedding, and you know, and so it was just really beautiful to kind of have like that net, like that community. And that's really what I encourage, like, for folks. It's like find your community, find the folks that will lift you up on your darkest days, and that will, and also that are creative and that are artists and, you know, like in their own ways, because then, you know, you'll have like these really beautiful conversations and you'll realize like I'm in a safe space, you know, like everyone is rooting for me, I'm rooting for them. So I think that was like the biggest support system, was just having that rooted group of other creative artists that we felt like we could just call each other, you know, family.
That's really important. I think just in your formative years, having that in general, just a big support group, regardless if it's, you know, a creative support group or just that group that you can call on, I think really, really helps. And I can attribute that same thing to me, but me being Latino, you know, you growing up from, you know, like you said, mixed race family, it seems like that's something that support and larger groups of people kind of work hand in hand.
Yeah, because you know, right, like growing up like in a multiracial environment, everyone kind of has their standards, but then they also, but if you're serious enough, and if they realize that they can't change you and you are who you are, then they're going to support it. They're like, oh, so you really are going to do this. Okay. Well, I realize that I can't stop you. So I got to support you, like that's, or I have to continue believing in you. Because even, like notions of like graduate school, like both my parents didn't graduate from college. I'm first gen. And so the traditional standard of graduate from high school, yeah, okay, go to college, sure, graduate, get married, have kids. Like that's like a very standard, traditional like element of kind of like just being an adult. But my way was a little different. Like I kind of transitioned between schools. I took a semester off. I changed my major. I was like really trying to kind of get a sense of, okay, so who is Jen? Like, what is she really supposed to be doing? And then when I was finally done with like undergrad, the expectation was you go get a job, you get in a relationship, you have children. But it was like, nah, man, I want to like go to grad school. I want to keep learning. I want to like keep pushing myself. And then it was just like, yeah, but okay, well, do you have to? Like, this is just like, aren't you tired of school? Kind of a thing. Like that was kind of how I felt at times. But like during my first grad show at Micah, like my mom was like in tears because she was like, man, like this is for real. Like you're really doing this. And then when I started teaching right after grad school, my dad sat in on like one of my first classes. He was like, like this is, I could tell like they really felt a sense of pride being able to kind of see what happens when you let your kid that you raised and you raised well, when you let them really go all the way. It feels good. Like it feels good to have like your kid kind of stand in their own sense of self and their own identity. So yeah.
So how did that, I mean, you just talked about how your parents kind of felt a sense of pride, but I want to flip
Yes.
that back on you, right? Having your mom see your show and having your dad be in class. When did you see that finally click from their perspective?
It wasn't really until after all of it, honestly. It wasn't until like I became a mother, and like mothering is really what helped to define me. Like some people are like, oh well, when I got married I felt my sense of purpose, but there are still aspects of when I got married I felt like I was still under a lot of pressure, because you're like, man, I'm a wife now and I have to like, do everything. I gotta be like the most beautiful and to be the most desirable 24/7. Like there are a lot of these like misconceptions even after you married your best friend, and a lot of that is like, look, like I married you for you. Like, but there's still there's still the sense of, man, I gotta like stay on top of it. But then when I became a mom, I was like, man, like even if I wake up horrid, this is me. Like this is who I really am. And so mothering ended up really, it helped to focus me, and it really helped me to like understand on the more important things in life, and to understand that any art and any design that I'm going to continue to create from this point on is going to be the most genuine and the most true and the most honest, because like I have no other choice but to come to the table like as my true self.
So thinking about your true self, when did you personally consider yourself a creative?
A creative, and I guess that just depends on how like creativity is defined. Creativity like in terms of like artistry, or creativity in terms of, okay, well this is what I'm gonna, like I have this much, so I'm gonna use this much to make this. That's what creativity means to me. It's not always like, okay, well what can you make when you're at your best. It's like, what can you make when you don't have a lot, or when the odds are against you, or when people feel like, well, she's at this point, like how is she even going to be able to make this, or to like to make these moves, or to advocate change when she doesn't really have much. So I think one of my biggest moments of feeling like I was creative and like I felt like I could really stand in my own was like just through this past summer with COVID, and being already like excited about relationships that I had been forming with people and speaking, and I was like this close to like getting ready to like release like my second book. And but then with COVID I'm like, man, like a lot of us felt like, wow, this is like really cutting off so much for us. Felt like, isolated, and we felt like, well, I don't have this and I don't have these tools, and I don't, so how am I going to continue to foster these relationships and make new connections if I'm not with my students or if I'm not at my studio? So I felt like, well, this is where I truly feel like a creative, because I didn't have access to all of those things that I felt like defined who I was as an artist and as a designer. Like I just had like my little corner studio at home, like literally, like it's so tiny, and I have like all these distractions. This is like probably the first time in a while where I have felt the most creative, and where I felt like it all just kind of came together.
Awesome. I think that's really honest and open of you to basically state that just recently you personally felt that sense of creativity, because I think this question for me is not necessarily how anybody else defines it but you. And I don't want anybody to look at it and say, well, what is the typical versions of what we think of as creativity, and who determines that? Is it a degree, a this? I think we all need to come into it in our own. And I really think that your definition of how everything kind of come together, how everything came together, and really kind of made you see something in a different light was really eye opening. So I think, as you know, you talked about defining really, and I think before we start our conversation, from my research, or what a lot of the stuff that you talk about as an art activist and an educator has to do a lot with the area of disability. And so, really, to educate me and anybody else listening, do you think we can define some of these terms that can kind of help people frame maybe the conversation we're going to be having, so that we can all be on the same page at least? And I just want you to I'm going to run through some terms that we may come across during our conversation, and really just want your definition of this. So is that cool?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. So let's start off with the word disability.
So yeah, I mean, with the word disability, I mean, it really means that, someone who has a physical impairment, or someone who is, whether they're like a wheelchair user, or whether they have like an invisible disability, whether it's something like autism or ADHD, or someone who has like an anxiety disorder, or someone who, like, there are so many different aspects of disability. And so it's not something that is, oh, like a disease that needs to be fixed. And disability isn't necessarily, it's not a broken term either. It can be a term that is like a legit like identity.
Thank you. Ableist or
Yeah.
ableism.
So yeah, so I mean, it could go both ways. Like, so whether you're an ableist, or whether something is under the oppressive nature of ableism. So ableism in certain aspects are just the way that disabled folks are treated, especially folks who have invisible disability. So someone who has an anxiety disorder, or someone who is autistic, basically framing them as someone who is incapable of being able to accomplish a lot. So, oh, well, you can't do this, or you're wild, or you're acting out. Basically putting someone like in a box, and not really being open to like or celebrating their full true selves. So calling people crazy, calling people idiots, calling people stupid, those are aspects of ableism. Or just being able to kind of oppress someone and putting them in a box because they are like in a wheelchair. It's like, okay, well, they're incapable, like they're disposable. Those are aspects of ableism that like really bother me.
True. Let's go and move on to this one, which is probably closely related, but anti-racist.
Yeah, so being someone who is anti-racist means that you're going to celebrate culture, you're going to celebrate identity, you're going to center, folks who are different, folks who have disabilities, folks who have very unique ways of communicating, non-speaking people speaking, disabled folks who do speak. So just being able to kind of center them and making sure that they're celebrated for being their true authentic selves. And I definitely want to like elaborate on like impairment, because like I don't even necessarily like that word either. Like I used that earlier, but impairment is also another word for me that is ableist, because it's like, okay, well, just because someone doesn't necessarily, because someone who is non-speaking, oh, well, they're impaired because, or because you're deaf, you're hard of hearing, you have an impairment, which means that we're not going to be able to be friends, or we're not going to be able to communicate, or you can't be in the White House one day because you're deaf, or because you have a disability. That's automatically how a lot of disabled folks feel. It's like, okay, well, I'm disposable because I don't do things like you do, or because I'm not quote unquote normal. It's like, what is normal? So making sure that people feel, again, centered and celebrated because of their disability.
Mm-hmm. And these two are newer to me, and I think be nice to understand these a little bit. But neurodiverse and neurotypical.
Yeah. So, and those were terms that I learned when Knox, my son, was diagnosed as autistic. And then even with, folks that are a part of the same like neurodivergent family. So folks who have ADHD. So it's just neurodiversity, it's just folks, it's just another way to define specific disabilities that are cognitive, that have all things to do with the way that your brain operates, with the way that you behave, with the way that you operate. And then neurotypical is like someone who does not have a cognitive or like a developmental disability, someone who is, non-disabled. So those are just specific terms to kind of help define different elements of disability or non-disability.
And one of the last ones, spectrum.
Yeah. So spectrum is kind of like, some people refer, and this is where like I'm gonna lean more towards like autism experts. I know some people just prefer to be called, I'm an autistic person. Spectrum is just another way to actually like articulate autism as like a very like faceted cognitive difference or cognitive disability, because there are some autistic folks who are non-speaking. There are some autistic folks who stim a lot, who like use their bodies in like really unique ways. There are some autistic people who like prefer loud noises, some who don't. Like my son Knox, like he's kind of like a mix of both. Like he's a very loud person himself, and he loves loud music, but then sometimes like noises that are like abrupt, like when they shock him, like the blender or like the smoothie maker, he's just like, nah, man. Like, or even when something scares him, like when it's like a really spooky part in the movie, he's like, oh. And so I have learned in meeting different autistic people and different autistic friends that I have, that everyone has a very different way of being able to just be autistic. And so like, and I love that there is a full wide range of what autism is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I said, I'm not really going to get into the mechanisms of like, well, who defined the word spectrum, because that's not my wheelhouse, and that can go like in the resources. But yeah, it's just like another way to kind of define. But honestly, like the folks who are within the autistic community, they just prefer to be identity first, like straight up, like I'm an autistic person.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate just taking the time to help set the language a little bit, just because we may be using these during the conversation, or just, making sure that we all feel a little bit more comfortable in using terms that maybe we're just not used to sometimes. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And so, we run into the same design circles, and we follow each other on social media, and it's been a while since I began following you. So I really don't remember like how we actually first connected. Somehow we're just in the same, design circles. But what I do remember though is seeing photos of your son Knox. And I remember seeing your posts for advocating for autism. And like you just mentioned, and that I read that Knox at 3 years old, I think, was diagnosed with being autistic, and it seems to propel you forward. And as you put it, redesigning ableist visual culture. Now I read that and I was like, okay, that's a powerful statement. So with that, what does that term mean to you? And maybe a little bit more importantly, how do we start achieving something like that?
Yeah, no, and thank you. And it really took me a while, oftentimes when, especially, Black families and Black and Latino families, like oftentimes, like, I've met so many families who are like, well, that's a label, and you shouldn't even call your kid autistic, and you shouldn't even call him disabled because that's like offensive, and you're oppressing him. And it's really, and so that whole redefining and kind of like reclaiming like specific ways that disabled folks are and the way that they celebrate themselves, making sure that that comes to the forefront, and then also making that in itself is a norm. And I felt like, I'm not speaking on behalf of like the entire autism and the disability community. I can only speak from my perspective and how I want people like me to celebrate disabled folks and who are willing to come to the table and who are encouraged to come to the table like as their true, full, authentic selves, you know? And that's what I really love about the disability community is that, you know, whether they choose to disclose their disability or whether they choose to kind of navigate through it in their own way, but we should still honor it, and we should still let folks know that they're celebrated. So I feel like that's like really what my role is as an artist and as a designer and as a mother and as like an organizer and like a community builder, is to make sure that people within the disability community feel like, okay, well, man, like I have like my pack, and my pack is a safe space for me to feel like I can just be me. Not so much like, well, society, like I need to be able to learn how to conform, and I need to be able to learn. And if I want to be included in this space, I need to be able to learn the lingo, and I need to be able to mask, and I need to be able to talk the talk. No, it's like those spaces should shift. Like those spaces should change so that they can become more accommodating to you know, to who you are, and to celebrate and to center like you just as like your true self. I mean, period. Like that's just, you know, it's very simple in terms of what some of these spaces really want to do. But those types of conversations need to be able to happen in very small ways, like in something as simple as like a photo zine, you know, something as simple in a photograph, you know, like that's really like what my role is. It's like I'm shifting the way that people are looking at these images. There's an organization that I really love called Affect the Verb / Disabled in Here. And what they do is they commission disabled photographers and illustrators, designers to basically take charge and to create stock images that disabled folks can use, or that, you know, non, you know, disabled folks can use when it comes to representing the disability community. Like oftentimes we just see the typical standard white person like in a wheelchair, and that's like our only viewpoint of disability. Or we may see, you know, like the white autistic kid, you know, like kind of like in a room, like in a corner, like all oppressed and sad, you know. But that's not my definition of disability. Like my definition of disability is someone who uses a cane, someone who has disable invisibility, and they're like moving and dancing. And these aren't, you know, things that I'm making. Like these are actual disabled friends that I have that are like performers and actors, musicians, you know, like Leroy Moore, like from Crip Nation, and Mariah Person, you know, who is an amazing dancer, and she's also autistic. And so it's just it's really glorious to continue to kind of connect with those folks. And that's originally what my definition is of redefining ableist culture, ableist visual cultures, to be able to center these folks that don't get seen and that don't always have the opportunity. Like they're being overshadowed. And I'm gonna be honest, like, so for instance, like with Sia, you know, she recently released this movie called Music, and it's a musical, and it's centering an autistic character as, you know, she navigates her way through life, and how her world is like this musical, and she's really celebrating and visualizing her world like in this really beautiful way. And it is, you know, like how autistic people live. Like my son lives in an everyday musical, but the disability community specifically felt like, well, why did you have to hire a non-disabled actor or a neurotypical actor to mimic an actual autistic person, when you could have just hired an actual autistic performer or an actual actor? So a lot of and this is what Sia has written, and some of the articles like I've been able to kind of like dive into, but I just took from a combination of her tweets. You know, she's like, well, you know, like I had, people on the spectrum actually like on set and advising me. And then I actually wanted, like the film is based on an autistic friend that I had, but it would have been too much for him to actually be like in the role, and it would have been too hard. And it's like, yeah, but well, then if you feel like certain elements of performance are going to be too much, then you need to change the way that your movie is going to be made, or you need to
Mm-hmm.
maybe add, or maybe you need to add more time to the timeline to accommodate for this narrative that is supposed to be quote unquote about autistic people and celebrating and centering them. And so a lot of people have been questioning, like her motives and her intentions about like how much is this movie actually going to amplify the disability community, when often in media, and again, we are not making this up, like we've seen movies like Rain Man, and even like, I Am Sam with Sean Penn, and it's like, think about all of those spaces where disabled actors could have actually been hired and been paid for just for being an actual performance artist, for being an actor. And so I feel like whenever artists have the opportunity to be able to amplify the disability community, like it should come from someone from, who has like a lived experience. And so it was really important for me when it came to KnoxRoxs to be able to say, okay, well, this is us as like a Black neurodivergent family. And when I wrote the zine, I wasn't even necessarily like claiming ADHD, and I wasn't even referring to myself as neurodiverse. But the more that I have learned about Knox and his disability, I'm like, man, like there are certain traits that we share and that I see. And instead of me necessarily being like, well, I'm gonna have to change him and I'm gonna have to change myself. And trust me, there have been times where I have felt pressured. And then COVID alone, woo, like COVID, because we were together 24/7. I mean, and being and bonding and just continuing to just love up on each other and just embracing like everything that about us that is unique. Like that was just a really beautiful moment.
One of the things, as maybe a response to what you were talking about, where like an ableist perspective, in the Sia example, is that we need to fit some people in the way that we understand the world, as maybe people who are neurotypical. And how do we start to think about, well, how do we empower, how do we include, how do we make sure that we're amplifying something else that maybe isn't what we're used to, but is going to affect and impact other people, because if they see themselves as part of this community, they understand that they belong because other people are seeing them for who they are, right? And I think from just your conversation is understanding that the Sia mishap looks like it was a missed opportunity for to be able to elevate people to be part of this, to think about spectrum people in the acting community, or how they can be part of just on set. And also, I think that one of the biggest things is then having to reshift the expectations or the timeline, right? If you know that, like you mentioned, her friend couldn't do that thing, then we need to adjust for that instead of just being like, well, I can't do it and then move on. So that to me starts to go into the idea of how you perceive people understanding maybe disability, or actually not understanding disability. And for you, one of the big things that I want us to talk about is this zine. I think it was a 50-page zine. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's like 40 to 50 pages. I lose track because you got like the double page spreads and
Mm-hmm. And this is, doing my research, this is a photo, representation typographic book that you and your husband Kevin put together. Can you really break down the creative decisions about the use of photography, the typography, things like that, and like the meanings behind it?
I had like this project, it's like it's my baby. And I knew again when it came to me continuing to just acclimate myself with the autism community, I was like, man, I'm seeing a lot of oppressive language, a lot of ableist language being used towards kids and being used towards like autistic adults. And a lot of my heartache specifically came from parents, who are supposed to be the biggest advocates and who are supposed to be like the biggest, fans of their kids, are oftentimes the most oppressive when it comes to disability And when it comes to creating safe spaces for them, there are a lot of parents that amplify their disabled kids, but then there are a lot of parents who just don't, and who use the public, or use like their public platforms to basically like spread lies and to spread more oppression, and to just spread, you know, very negative portrayals of their kids, you know, as a way of, oh, maybe like pity, and or just maybe, you know, using their platform to say, well, this is why you need to love me and follow me because everything is so hard. But it's like, yeah, but what is that really doing to the disability community as a whole? What is that really doing to your kid? I'm not pitying you. I'm pitying the way that you're complaining about your child, the way that you're, you know, adding so much heaviness, and the way that you're portraying them as like this burden, like this person that needs to be stopped, and this person that needs to be fixed because they're broken, and they're living in this prison of disability, or they're living in this prison of autism. And so the book really came from me wanting to really shift the narrative, me really wanting to kind of change the way especially Black and Latino kids are viewed within the disability community, especially when it comes to an invisible disability, something that people feel like they fear it. They are scared of things that they don't understand and things that they can't always articulate. So, you know, they're going to view it as like, okay, well, this is the enemy. We have to pray this away. You have a demon child. You need to fix your kid. Like, we all know that is how a lot of kids are viewed. A lot of kids who are ADHD, or who have, you know, who are autistic, they're often viewed as like these kids that, man, I've met folks that are just like, no, like, I don't believe in autism. You just need to like pray that away, or your kid needs healing. And so these were a lot of the things that like that were coming at me, you know, with things. And I was really trying to research, and I was really trying to be mindful, and to like accept what my role was like as a mom to a disabled kid. And I wasn't realizing, like, because at that time I was really masking like my own personal disabilities. Like, I have thyroid disorder, and then I also have undiagnosed ADHD and anxiety. But I was really writing that off as, oh, something's just wrong with me, and I'm not normal, I'm lazy, and, you know, like, I'm not capable, and oh my God, like, I'm just, adulting is so hard, and these are, you know, and I was really trying to weigh myself down instead of like getting help and getting support, because we all know that this isn't really about like fixing me. It's just making sure that I have the support that I need to be able to navigate.
So let's think about what are the actual decisions going into, let's say, why photography, why type choices, things like that, and what was the purpose of the book?
So I definitely wanted to make sure that the book wasn't like this clinical reference guide. Like, never once in the book that I like define what autism is, and I never define in the book, well, these are like the do's and don'ts, and this is, you know, because I felt like that's not really like my role. Like, I'm not a clinician. And I feel like those kinds of things can like be explored in like other spaces, and I have like explored those other things in other places when it comes to, you know, fair treatment and equitable treatment when it comes to folks who are disabled, especially like kids and Black kids. So the book is really just a love letter. Like, that's how I always describe it. Like, it's just like a love letter to the Black and Latino autistic community, and then also like my love letter to my child, who, you know, when he's 21 years old one day, because he's not going to never not be autistic. And so I want for him to live consistently in a place where he feels like he's being celebrated and uplifted. And a lot of that starts with, okay, well, how did my parents even view me when I was a young child, and when I was learning how to actually navigate through life, and when I was actually like learning how to be a person and learning how to exist. And so I wanted for him to be able to go back to looking at these images where he's just spreading joy and uplifting joy. And so a lot of what is rooted in the zine in itself is like autistic joy. And there are so many things that like that like sprung out from that book, like fun stickers and things like that, that really helped. And I've written essays on like autistic joy, and being able to not fear our disabled kids, because there's really no room for that. There's room for support, and there's room for celebration and for joy. You know, not that all moments are going to be easy peasy, and there's going to be moments where you're really going to have to think about a lot. So the photos themselves are like joyful and just really uplift, and especially like a Black and Latino kid, like just being able to see like really true beautiful images of just him existing
Mm-hmm.
while he's alive, because we've read countless articles about autistic kids who have been murdered, who are uplifted and celebrated, and they're not even here anymore. And then when it comes to the languages in the book, I knew that it was important that the essays, and there's poems, and there's also conversations that Knox had with us that are dispersed throughout different pieces of the book. And then there are phrases that are overlaid on top of different textures, like that say, autistic, brave, beautiful, singer, hugger, happy, words that, because the book is not just for families, like it's for kids. It's like if an autistic kid wanted to pick up this book, or like a family member of like an autistic kid, like I wanted for them to be able to see themselves reflected in the book. But then I also wanted to make sure that the words themselves and the language that was used in the book are words of amplification, not words that are just like, don't worry, like you'll be better one day, or, your autism doesn't define you, because in essence it's who you are, like it's your identity, and you should never try to mask, and you should never, try to shy away from something that makes you who you are, and that defines you.
Mm-hmm. Totally. So I think the representation of what you're talking about and the visuals, and it's unfortunate that you even have to, as a mother, even think about representing your child, and even stating that something of that he has to still be alive. And that's a whole nother conversation that I know is rooted in maybe one of the reasons why you created this book, and for him to reflect back on what he looked like in that pure joy self. It just pains me sometimes to hear when people have to do that, unfortunately. But one of the things that I was listening to when I was doing research, and I think you were on the Uninvisible podcast, talking about this more so, was that obviously in trying to craft this book, you didn't really see a lot of conversation around Black and brown voices and experiences in disability or in the autism space. So you had to do a lot of research, obviously, in this. How did you go down that rabbit hole into something that maybe you feel didn't exist? Because now it looks like at least your creation of this zine is help filling that void. But how did you first even think about, as a design researcher, how do we have to do that kind of work to start to say, how am I starting this conversation that maybe has never been talked about or in the visual world like you were creating?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And so, as I said earlier, like I was really hounded with like this oppressive, even things that were in the media, that were, oh, like these kind of mechanical, like mimicry, like autism characters that weren't really celebrating or amplifying autistic people. And usually they were only portrayed as white. And so I got tired of reading clinician definitions and, even spaces, like Autism Speaks that still advocate for like a cure. And there's not a lot of autism based representation of people that are even on their board. And these are things that are factual and that the autism community has a lot of issues with, because, there are a lot of people that still view autism as like a disease, and that's something that, oh, we need to dedicate research into, sorting out this cognitive disorder and fixing people. And I was like, well, right, like where, because these voices already existed, like Black and brown spaces in terms of like disability amplification, like they already existed. But like you said, they're not, like I'm expected to view it as an illness. So those are the first resources that I'm going to seek out, right? It's like, okay, well, because my son isn't normal and he needs to be fixed, those are the only things that I feel like can fill like this particular space, right? Like I feel like I'm being misguided into thinking that that's kind of like where it ends, where it starts and where it ends. And so Twitter, I mean, disability Twitter, like that was just like a really beautiful space where I felt like a lot of disabled folks were able to just be like unfiltered, unbought, unbossed. They were able to just come true. And I was really listening to, I stopped reading neurotypical parents, disabled parents or autistic parents, like I was comfortable like reading those particular tweets, especially when they were talking a little bit about like, this is what they do with their kids. And then I started reading tweets from autistic adults. And I was like, man, like this is the space. And I started, reading spaces like the Autistic People of Color Fund, autismandrace.com, the platform that where they raise funds for like community reparations for autistic people of color. I was like, man, this is a really dope. These people are like trying to survive. They're just trying to like exist as like their true selves. And they're about empowerment, like empowering like the autistic community. And for me, once I started reading a lot of like radical musings and radical like reflections of folks that were like rooted in disability justice, I was like, man, this is truly the space that I need to be following, and just actual autistic voices and perspectives. Like those were the spaces that to me really helped to define the movement and to realize that I cannot like fear is the enemy, like I can't rely so much on just the things that I don't understand. It's like, well, how can I support the community? Like what can I be doing as an artist and as a designer and as a parent? And then, I started feeling safer too in terms of like self-disclosure and being able to just, be very forward and forthright with like my own disability and realizing that I could be empowered by like being completely honest and true. And I started doing that like among my students, especially now with COVID. Like I had to tell students, I'm like, look, like I have my own disabilities, I have my own differences, and this is like a place where we can be safe and where you can feel comfortable disclosing it or just being open and being honest and true. Like this is a safe space, and I'm going to be here to kind of make sure that you have the accommodations that you deserve and that you should get. You shouldn't have to fight for accommodations.
Great. I mean, I think one, totally floored by the fact that disability Twitter was a lot of places where you found that, because I go down a rabbit hole on Twitter, but it tends to be a more negative rabbit hole, and I'm glad that we can start to see the positivity in that. So there's a lot of ways that you talk about advocating for people with disability and things like that. And one of the things that I tend to hear you speak a lot about, and what you use in your writing and what you produce, is the word joy. How has the word joy been like a mantra for you?
Yeah, because to me, being joyful is completely like existing in like this unbridled, like unlimited space where you feel like you can just be just your true self. And I say that phrase a lot, like true and authentic self, like authenticity, like feeling secure and feeling like you don't have to ask permission. You don't have to, seek anyone out to say, well, can I just be happy? Like, can I just be encouraged to just exist as me? Like, do I have to shift? Do I have to change? So much that some people become like super experts on really masking their disabilities. I mean, Chadwick Boseman, for example. And I know that close people within his circle knew, but he also felt like, okay, well, I don't want it to necessarily get out because first of all, like it was his business. But then there's also going to be like a community of people that are just going to be like, well, you're disabled, so you shouldn't have any place on a movie set anyway, because they were already degrading him because he was, losing weight, and because he was, getting the care that he needed, but his body was going to do what it was going to do. And there were already so many people that were ableist, oh, get him a sandwich, like, why is he so thin, And so people weren't even realizing what they were doing and the way that they were perpetuating like this oppressiveness to someone who wasn't even really disclosing their disability and their medical situation, because of however he felt like he was going to be viewed. It really just comes down to, as long as we're there to support the disability community and again, to like kind of center their goals and center like what they want, and making sure that if you're going to talk about them, that they're actually a part of the conversation versus like talking around them or talking over them. And so that in itself has really helped me center like the way that I talk about like disability, and especially about joy, you know, and realizing that you can be happy in those times that are difficult, and really just kind of like celebrating like your existence. And it's not always going to be easy, but I feel like especially this past summer, you know, and you folks like Walter Wallace Jr. and, you know, whatever he was going through, you know, and the fact that, you know, his family, and this is like, again, I'm not making it up, like this was filmed, you know what I mean? Like he was literally, there were no de-escalation tactics that were being used at all, and his family had to like advocate and to come out and put themselves in the line of fire, you know, and he still ended up being snuffed out. And it goes on, you know, like so many disabled folks, you know, where they're not just walking in the street, like they're actually at home and they're getting killed like in what is supposed to be a safe space, like in their own neighborhoods. So I often feel like we don't really start having these conversations while these people are alive and just existing, that we don't often honor them until like, oh well, they're no longer here. Let's celebrate them. And I'm just keeping it real in terms of like the, you know, the Black and brown community, like that's usually when we have these conversations, and we don't really uplift them when they're still alive. And that's why like I'm just so grateful for communities like Sins Invalid and like Crip Hop Nation and Be Heard DC, you know, who amplify, you know, like Black and brown deaf folks. Those are the communities that I really rely on. The creative communities, like the disabled artists and visionaries that are out here trying to like shift and change like the focus of the conversation to be like, look, like this is me and this is how I celebrate everything about me. You know, everything about my body, everything about the way that I think, the way that I communicate, the way that I operate, that is not like you
Mm-hmm.
know? So I feel like those are like the biggest avenues and the biggest amplifications of like what disability joy can mean. And then autistic joy in particular is because there are so many stigmas related to autistic people, like the lack of empathy, and just because I'm not looking at you means that I'm disrespecting you. But it's like, well, some folks can't focus eye to eye at all times. But trust me, like even Knox doesn't look at me all the time, but he's focusing, like he's focusing in his own way in terms of like what I'm saying. Or even if I just choose to just design differently or just move differently, like that's not necessarily me being disrespectful. Or even if I'm not smiling, if I'm just looking at you, or if I'm just like ruminating or listening to like what you're saying, like that's just me like expressing like my happiness. And those are things that I'm still learning.
Exactly. And I think you mentioned a lot of good things, especially, you know, talking about the summer of 2020, which is been one of the most turbulent ones that I think about in a long time. And you know, as we're dealing with so many things, creatives have been challenging the status quo and inventing new ways to talk about systematic inequalities. And obviously, from your conversation on Bronx Net, you didn't start the Black Disabled Lives Matter movement, but you created the Black Power Fist infinity logo on it and kind of, you know, use type and bold iconography to create a visual message that has impact. What were you uplifted most by the response to that visual?
So really the symbol came from a place of me just wanting to just artistically respond to everything that was happening. And it was just like my own aspect of like social media activism and virtual activism. You know, a lot of folks were out there marching, and I knew that I couldn't necessarily always be at every single protest or every single rally. Not that I even needed to be, you know, because of COVID and because making sure that people were safe, and that I was safe and that my family was safe. And so I made the symbol in itself free and like a downloadable poster, so that folks could feel like, man, like this is like a piece of artwork that can unify us and that could be seen as like this really bold message, you know, for folks who were already in the disability community and then folks who were brand new to the disability community. Because we all know white people came out in droves. Like, let's just be real. They came out from under the woodworks. I mean, people who like hadn't spoken to me in like months were like, "Are you okay? Like, is everything fine? Oh, like this graphic, can I share it? Oh, like can we include it in this? And oh, like we want you to come." And I'm like, "Okay, well, where have you been? Like, where have you been this entire time? I was always here. I was always, uplifting Black and Brown disabled folks, like for a while now. But it almost took like COVID, unfortunately, to like remind a lot of people like who was really at risk
Mm-hmm.
and who has been suffering for decades. And because this conversation has been, like, we all know, like, I mean, people were like legit questioning, well, does systemic racism even exist? And we weren't even talking about like the disparities between, no, literally, like someone said to me, and someone I've known for a long time, they were like, "Oh, that is just liberal language that you learned at your liberal college. That systemic racism doesn't really exist, and that it's not real, and that it's not like an actual true representation of what is happening right now." Like, I'm not making this up. Like, I tweeted about this and everything. So we have people who are already like, and this is like well after the symbol came out, and after like I continued to talk a little bit about like, Black disabled lives, and how much we need to uplift them and we need to amplify them while they're still alive. And so there were a lot of spaces that were like, well, we need resources, and all these magazines that were coming in droves wanting to write their own, who had no clue, and who weren't even talking about disability before, and all of a sudden they wanted to talk about it now. Like, if anything, those are things that I thought was really interesting that happened as a result of the symbol being out there and being used in so many ways. I was like, man, I'm like, well, if this is what it's going to take to help perpetuate a conversation of justice and to kind of help uplift the movement. And like I said, like, I didn't create the movement. It's not anything that existed when this symbol came. This symbol was just me. Like, again, it was just like a tribute, like a love letter, because I do everything in love. And so this was just my way of being able to continue the conversation that had already been around for so long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it seems like, unfortunately, like you said, it takes a global pandemic for people to start to see, the inequalities that are happening at home, and it's sad, and it's sad that people use rhetoric to kind of help justify how they maybe be blissfully unaware of what's really going on, and maybe to have this visual help spark a conversation is part of the things that we need, right? And that's how creativity and art can be so impactful, even to people that we're not necessarily designing for. And so, you mentioned earlier, obviously as an educator, how do you acknowledge, especially now in hybrid or virtual environments, if your students are, neurodiverse or differently abled? And how do me as an educator start to understand, how can I even think about acknowledging and understanding how that is in this new, virtual way we learn now.
Yeah, and remember, you don't have to say differently able. Just say disabled. Just say disabled folks, because able-bodied people, we can let them shine all they want. But if we take the dis out of disability, like, then we're basically, we're not celebrating disabled people. And this is just coming from the disability activism community, like language that I have learned, throughout the past couple years. And there's like a lot of really good resources that I can drop about that. But thank you so much for that question, because it's so important. There's a website called Mapping Access. They actually released like a really beautiful teaching in the day in the days and times of COVID, and rethinking what accessibility can mean for students. And it's things that students, disabled students have been advocating for all the time. Like, well, can I have more time on taking this exam? Can you repeat the information a little bit more clearly for me? Can we have a one-on-one? Can I meet with you during your office hours? Can we possibly like reframe the project a little bit so that I can understand some of the language that you're trying to use? These accessible requests aren't necessarily anything that are new, that disabled students and even disabled faculty have been requesting. I was a part of like this really cool panel over the summer, like the AIGA Educator Summit, and we talked a lot about this topic. And one of my biggest things was just continue to remain flexible, because it is the law. There is an actual American with Disabilities Act that justifies a lot of the accommodations that these students need and a lot of the accommodations that, employees need in whatever space that they're working in. So flexibility is an amazing thing. Like honesty and openness is a thing that to me shouldn't be just for the privileged, but that they should be for everybody. Especially now, like this is just a very challenging time just because, a lot of people were thrown off. They're like, ooh, like remote learning, but we all know Zoom and Skype have always been existing. We've been having meetings like this. Yes, it wasn't to like this full capacity, but just making sure that as a professor that you're just ready to kind of support the students as best as they need that kind of support. And then if you're unable to provide that support to them, pointing them at least like in a good direction. So whether that's like the disability office, like on your campus, hopefully, if they're like a true disability office where they're there to help support the students and not just throwing out accommodation letters and expecting the faculty to kind of take the reins. I've been a part of like a couple of different like disability summits throughout the summer. And then I've also seen other universities, realize that they have to take on a more active role when it comes to assembling the right people to be a part of these conversations. And at least, even if those summits don't always provide quote unquote like the answers, but at least they provide a space of support and visibility for disabled faculty, disabled staff, disabled students to feel like, ooh, like my university, like the space where I work, they really want to see me and they really want to respect me and they really want to hear me.
I definitely think that the shift to this and the accessibility factor of things are just something that we're all now being more attuned to, because the accessibility for this is we have to, change the way we address things and making sure that we are more accommodating, because for anybody, this whole situation is a lot more tricky than we all thought it would be. And because there's a whole new pedagogy that you need to do for, just online virtual learning in general, and then just understanding, the special needs or the needs for anybody, not even special needs, because it's just everybody actually needs a little bit more time. Anybody needs a little bit more, we need more time. So one of the things also is, so you're talking about obviously how educators can help students. How can students help themselves? How can they advocate for themselves in this situation?
So self-advocacy is key. And I always like encourage my students, like, even while we're lecturing or even while like I'm in the middle of like doing a presentation, like, stop me. Like my autistic students, they are known to like interrupt me like at the drop of a hat. And I just let them talk and I'm like, okay. Or I always tell them, I'm like, look, I'm available during office hours. I'm on a text basis with some of my disabled students just because like I just know that I have to be there. But I'm also very true in letting them know, like, look, like, I have to put my son to bed, but these are my office hours. I'm available. So I'm always there to be an open ear, and I make sure that they know that. And I tell my students, and I'm like, if you disappear, that's like a big concern. It's like, I would rather see you. I would rather you flood my emails, because then at least I know like you want to continue being successful. Like, and to me, like, that's like a form of self-advocacy. It's like, hey professor, like I need help, or I don't have this, or are you sure this is what, what you're asking for the project? So I encourage students, like, don't be afraid to just be like completely honest and to practice self-advocacy, and then to feel comfortable disclosing like what your disability is, because not all students have like accommodation letters. And so like I'm encouraging them to like get those accommodation letters and to let faculty know, like, well, this is like what my specific situation is.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a testament maybe to the educators too, where a student is able to be comfortable enough to share themselves with that, and to know that they, like you mentioned, have a safe space, or also feel that they can come and talk to these things. Because I think that's one of the things, as maybe, students don't understand that they can, or students don't actually have that feeling of allowing themselves to be that authentic, because maybe just the professor is not presenting themselves that way. And so I also take it as when a student comes to me in any circumstance to kind of say, I need to talk to you about a personal situation. To me, I feel honored in the ability to be like, you trust me enough. And I think that's really good as educators, for us to build that trust and to know that we are going to be honest with our students. It could be tough, it could be this, but it's tough love. and and to allow us to understand and be in their worlds, I think is really helpful, because like you said, when you're honest with them and saying, well, I have to put my son to bed and I have to do this, they understand that you're sharing yourselves with them, and they maybe feel a little bit more comfortable with that. So that's one of the things that I think I agree with, kind of being not sheltering and shutting yourselves off from any student, actually, and allowing yourself to kind of be honest with who you are. So as we start to get closer to the end, and you seem to, with your creativity, express yourself with photo collages and bold iconography and type. What do you think gets you into that creative mood?
I've really had to just let go a lot of just how I feel that define should look, or oh well, this is trendy, so I need to do, and I need to design this way, or I need to design in that way. Like, I've started really letting go of the trends and what I feel like is the quote unquote right way, and letting go a lot of what I feel like will be embraced and accepted. And then the minute that I choose to go with my gut, and I've said this many times, like to myself, it's just like the minute that I stopped trying and the minute that I just kind of went with making sure that the language and that the imagery that I am using is like really accessible, and that the imagery and the language that I'm using, that it just resonates and that it's empowering and that it's not too complicated and that it's not too like, well, what is she trying to say? And like, that is what is important. If you want to say like disability solidarity, then just say it. If you want to say Black disabled lives matter, then just say it. There, like, you shouldn't have to sugarcoat or try to devise like this super technical way of being able to like make justice like accessible. Like, just say exactly what needs to be said, and say it in a way that is like uplifting, and that it centers, and that it celebrates a community that often feels like they're just not celebrated, period.
What are some aspects, or one aspect of the creative process that you still struggle with?
So I still struggle with, because I do have ADHD, like I still struggle with, work life balance and being able to kind of shut down, because like I feel like, oh, like it's all on me and I have to get this done and I have to meet this deadline. And then other times, like I have like a lot of burnout and a lot of meltdown. And you'll hear this a lot within, the disability community. Like, after every huge presentation, like we agonize over it. And then like you won't see us for like 2 or 3 days because we're like, nope, like I'm done, I'm out. And I'll see like my friends tweet about it. It'll be like some huge, like, disability summit where they put so much time into making sure that their presentation was just right, or making sure that all their research and things that they were going to uplift. It's a lot. Like, it takes a lot. Not that it's not necessary, but just being able to kind of come, and especially if it went really well, it's like, okay, well then like coming down from that high and being able to keep up with the demand, like that's like the really difficult thing, because it's like the minute that you're like, man, I'm going to come all out with it and I'm going to be really honest, that's when people are just like, well, I need you to do this, and I need this from you, and I need that from you. So it's just like being able to just educate people a little bit more about how to like be more patient, but then also realizing that it is okay to take a break. You don't have to say yes to everything, but then also being honest and telling some people, look, I don't really have the bandwidth right now, but I can connect you with someone else. Or if you don't mind waiting, that's why like I appreciate you, because you were just like, look, like I'm an educator too, and if we need to schedule this for like the next like 4 weeks, like we'll do it. And I'm like, yep. I'm like, I'm a hold it to, I'm a hold you to it, because I'm like, look, like if the conversation is going to happen, if and if it's really meant to be manifested, then it'll continue to happen. So just because like you first asked me like 6 weeks ago doesn't necessarily mean that everything that we're talking about today isn't still relevant as it was 6 weeks ago.
Oh, definitely.
Like when we first, so I have to be able to remember that, and I have to be able to like realize that, this conversation can still happen and we can still uplift a community, versus like, oh, like, well, I'm completely like inadequate, and he's not going to be my friend if I just kind of don't do this interview, and or if I'm not in this podcast with him. Like, so there's so much pressure sometimes that I put on myself to kind of make things happen. And a lot of that imposter syndrome, where I'm feeling like, oh, like this person is doing it better. Like, why is he even wanting to talk to me? Kind of like, so I still struggle. I still struggle with that a lot.
That's a creative struggle, right? That's what we all like, who am I to be in this conversation? Why are they talking to me? Am I going to say the right thing? I think we all we all struggle with those things. And I believe, even the amplification of, or the idea that you're talking about, as we get psyched up for a big presentation and then we need to have that self-care moment after, right? That's just taking care of yourself. That's just being, like, what? You've spent a lot of time and effort, and now you need time to decompress and not focus on those things. And I think that's a great way of kind of saying, what? Yeah, shut off all those things and those ways. What type of advice would you give a younger Jen entering the creative industry?
Yeah, so great question. So a lot of the advice that I give is I'm always going to start off with like, just be true to yourself. And if you know that certain lanes aren't your lane, like continue to kind of stay in your lane. And if you feel like you're really empowered by like a specific topic or theme or agenda, like stick with it and learn it and educate yourself. Whether that's related to like a specific color that pops up in your designs all the time, or like a word, or like, or a character, like just milk it and just continue to just embolden yourself with those particular tools and those things, because those are the things that we're going to notice. If it's rainbows, do rainbows. Like Amina Mucciolo, A Cloud in Your Rainbow, like they're one of my favorite artists and designers, another autistic, disabled artist. I mean, that is just like this true, beautiful, unabashed, reckless abandon, the way that, she approaches like her artwork and her design process. And you can tell that that's not a very rehearsed space. Like that's very much like a true, authentic space. And she's going to do it no matter what people say, or no matter how people try to coach her or try to package her work. And I've had folks try to do that to me. And it's like, well, what are you? Like, well, what are you really hoping to achieve? Or what are you calling all of this? Or what do you do? It's like people are always struggling so hard to like define like your mission and your purpose. And I'm like, you need to define it first before somebody else tries to define it for you. Now, it's different if you're like, hey, I need support, I need help. Can you help me understand like what this vision is and help me kind of like, navigate through it? And that's when you like seek a mentor or like an advisor, and you have those conversations with other people like within your field. But if you also feel like this is just a space where you need to exist in this way, then trust that, honor that, and don't necessarily try to break yourself from that honesty. And just continue learning. I mean, like, and then I always tell them that like learning, as we all know, it's like a forever thing. And I always tell them, my students on the first day of classes, I'm like, I don't know everything and I don't claim to know everything, because I want to be able to continue learning. I'm a lifelong learner and student. And I tell my students, I'm like, and I love learning from you. Like I love learning from cool things that you may have, or cool artists that you want to be able to highlight or that you want to uplift. So honesty, keep learning, keep exposing yourself to a lot. Like the learning never stops.
Agreed. Learning never stops. So what are you working on now? What's the future hold for Jen White Johnson?
I just hope that COVID goes away.
Yes, please, right?
I'm working just on just making more fun little zines. I've been asked to do like some fun zine workshops for some really cool spaces that I never thought that I would see myself in. And so just continuing to just be like this ambassador, and continue to just be open and available, and to just be like a really good representative for my community, and to continue just redefining what that can look like, and realizing that I just need to be open and just hold more space for like my design and my artwork, and that it needs to be out there. So whether it's like a huge big project or whether it's just like a small little zine, like something that I have coming up is like a cool little like branding marketing workshop with the Baltimore Creatives Network. And I'm going to be meeting a whole bunch of entrepreneurs for the first time, through Zoom, and going to be talking a little bit about, well, now that they're about to embark in this new, chapter in their lives, how do they really want to define their brand, and how are they, but not necessarily focusing on the commercialism of that brand, but how are you building a sense of community? How are you building a sense of engagement? And how are you building, a sense of liberation? Because that is the whole point of what this experience and this whole entrepreneurship journey is supposed to mean, right? Like, how are you freeing other people? And so making sure that people remember that collective, liberation cannot exist in a silo, and it can't be created in a silo. If you can't respect the way other people work, and if you can't respect and want to learn from the community around you, you need to stop.
Mm-hmm.
You just stop, because you can't really create it alone and on your own.
So true. I think community and collectiveness and working together on projects is how we move this conversation forward. So where can people continue to find out more about you?
So you can find me on my website at jenwhitejohnson.com. And then there I have like a whole bunch of really cool visuals of projects that I've worked on. And then there's a link on the website that will actually lead you to my little Weebly shop. E-commerce was never a thing. I never really thought that I would be selling stickers and shirts and poster prints. Like, that just wasn't really my thing, but it is now, because, it's just a way for me to continue sharing like my gifts. So my favorite thing now is being able to see people rocking like the Black Disabled Lives Matter shirt from like, whether it's like in Scotland, London, Cali, like, I'm not playing. Like, this is a legit movement, and it's like really empowering to see people feeling like they can just, that we can just all be together, if it's something as simple as like a t-shirt, or if it's like putting like a, an autistic joy or a Black Autistic Lives Matter sticker like on your skateboard. Like, me, that's just like, man, like, that's just all I've ever wanted, was just to be able to kind of share space with people in a variety of different ways. So those are the things that you can find on my shop, just disability justice, disability acceptance, and autistic joy, little fun things that you can just choose to kind of support me with. And yeah, and then I'm on Instagram at JT KnoxRoxs. That's JT and then KnoxRoxs, KnoxRoxs. So I love, getting DMs from people, and I love being able to meet other autistic people, other disabled folks. I love it. I love being able to kind of to be like in community with like.
I love it. I want to thank you, Jen, and I'm so amazed with our conversation and you enlightening me on just kind of where we need to be, how this conversation needs to continue to be amplified, and why the specific necessity of really showcasing Black and brown disabled people in a state of having joy, happiness, and maybe shifting the conversation from maybe all the negativity that tends to be surrounding that, is to make sure that we look upon them in a different light, and look upon them also in the same light as we look upon everything else. And some of the things that obviously we talk about is especially when we talked about, it's not either or, it's a yes and or how can we adjust, or how can we do this also. And I think that's one of the things, even from the first thing we mentioned when I was asking you to discuss this or that, and your conversation always was like, well, how come it can't be both? Right? So why why can't we be included? Why can't this conversation be part of a normal conversation, quote unquote normal, whatever that happens to be. And I think that's what the biggest takeaway from this conversation is that it's not about one thing, it's about including all things. And I want to thank you for just your honesty, your openness, and getting into your process and actually your perspective, and why you continue to do this, and how being a mother has helped shift and really create maybe your visual voice now. So I really thank you, and I really appreciate the time you had for us.
Yes, the master. Put it.
Thank you very much, and this has been Works in Process. Wow, that was such a good episode with Jen, and I'd like to thank her one last time. It was so inspiring to listen to how she's redefining ableist culture, making sure she advocates for her son, advocates for the community, and advocates for her students. If you want to see her work, or who she mentioned in the episode, check out the show notes at wip.show. The Works in Process podcast was created by me, George Garastegui Jr., and this episode has been edited by Hearsay Productions. Thanks so much for taking a journey with me, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be social, and let's connect on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And if you like the show, don't be shy. Feel free to leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. And until next time, remember, it's not always about what you create, but how you create it.